Okay, logic. So using a macro flow is one way of getting that flow that we were speaking about earlier. That's really important. So a rut that students often fall into is having really great analysis, but then no clear links between points. And it just causes you to have an inarticulate and quite confusing and wordy essay. So to combat this, you could create diagrams that are called logic flows, and they can help you build that strong essay with that clear thread woven throughout, and that thread being your thesis and the actual point that you're getting across. So logic flows can work in two different ways. You can have a micro flow, where you've got one point, and it helps you to step through your analysis to meet your intention, supporting that thesis, all like micro because it's just one point for one kind of body paragraph. And the macro flow is that bigger picture, the skeleton for the entire essay. And so that's the wide lens that we'll look at now that is helpful to use to structure and make your whole essay flow. So you need the following to build your macro logic flow. A thesis, of course. So it's the skull and the spine of your essay. So the spine really tells us it's throughout the whole thing. It's what you start with and it's what is woven throughout. Everything connects to it, and without it, your essay is paralyzed. So keep thinking when you're writing, everything that you write, every analytical point, every quote you choose in your body paragraphs, it's actually got to answer and be related to the thesis. So make that obvious. If you're arguing a certain thing, then explain why your analysis proves your point. And then the points themselves, so they correspond to your paragraphs and they connect all of the evidence together. So in your introduction, you should have your signposting, which just means you're introducing what your 3 points will be for your 3 paragraphs, and you would have your thesis. And then the points themselves, usually the order that you introduce the points in your introduction is then the order that you use for your body paragraphs. So the first thing that you introduce in your introduction is then the first body paragraph. So your basic points will be coming in the form of those topic sentences that you have in your finished essay. That should be telling the reader exactly what is in each paragraph. So don't make the mistake of not having a topic sentence or making your topic sentence not the first sentence. So some students fall into this idea of giving a bunch of sort of random context at the start of a paragraph, whereas you like talking about the time period or the author or something, but you're thinking about the paragraph and what it's about, and that's the topic sentence, the basis of the topic sentence. Your evidence, of course. Evidence is the limbs in your essay. So without it, your essay won't get very far because you don't have anything to actually support what you're arguing. So evidence can come in the form of key quotes, or key stylistic devices in the text. It could be dialogue or description or characterization. Anything can be used, but it has to just work to prove your argument. So relevance is key. the basic analysis and audience positioning, if audience positioning is relevant. So when you have a quote, it's great that you've got a quote. It's great that you've remembered a quote and you have that knowledge. But it's one thing to just remember quotes, and it's a whole other thing to really understand them. So you need to show that you can analyze the quotes to actually explain why they support the points that you're making. You can't just expect the reader to read it and go, yep, I understand, that's why this quote supports the thesis. You need to make that clear yourself. So you're peeling back the layers to examine what the author really means by different things. And then if you need to talk about audience positioning, then it's how does that position the audience to feel? What position do they take up? Do they agree with it? Do they disagree? That kind of thing. Then your closing statements at the end, defeat. So the essay isn't complete without those. Logic has the most strength when it's continued right through to the very end. So your conclusion should still have a really clear link to your thesis. It should be really obvious that you've argued your thesis when you reach your conclusion, because it should all be that circular idea. You should all start off with one idea, go around in that circle of looking at detail and evidence, and then your conclusion brings it all back together. Here is a bit of an example of how you can use a macro flow with this diagram here. So the best way to do it is to draw it physically. So if you've got some paper, you can do a quick sketch with notes and arrows. And it should look a bit like a flow chart with lots of connecting branches. So you would start with your thesis, underlying the most important words in it as well. And then you should try and repeat those words to make your argument really clear. Below your thesis, have topic sentences. They can just be rough topic sentences, but they need to be reflective of what the paragraphs are about. How does the point connect to your argument, and how will the evidence play into it? And branching off that, you've got your actual evidence itself, and usually you have 2 to 3 pieces of evidence. I usually went with 3. But it does depend on your specific situation. So generally you're going to have a little bit of context for your quote, then you're going to have the quote, then you're going to have the analysis. And then you're going to repeat that 2 or 3 times. Before that, you would have had the topic sentence, and then after that, you would have your concluding and your linking sentence or sentences. They can be 1 or 2 sentences depending on how you approach it. So evidence, analysis, so context, evidence, analysis, context, evidence, analysis. And then you finish off with making sure that your paragraphs link. So usually, you'll have that concluding and linking idea. So not only saying this is the general idea of what I just spoke about, but also broadening it to say, and this is what I'm about to speak about next. This is how it relates to this other thing as well. And once you're done, go back through and highlight where you have mentioned your thesis, either explicitly or implicitly. And make sure you've got plenty of color on the page. And if not, then you need to consider whether your argument is actually clear. You, as the author, are the one that really understands what you're going for, and you need to make sure the reader or the marker is aware of what you mean. So you can't leave those gaps for them to fill themselves. First of all, they may not know how to fill them, or they may fill them in the wrong way and interpret what you've got wrongly. And so there you have it. That is how a macro flow works, and you've got a huge amount of your essay already completed with all of your ideas down, and then it's just fleshing it out a little bit more with the wording of it. So that muscle and skin of your piece you might be lacking, but the structure is there. So practicing making sure it flows is really important. This is all part of this idea of planning. So regardless of whether you use this or you have a different method of planning that you prefer, just use some kind of planning. That is what I would recommend. Okay, so a bit of a summary of the basic ingredients for analytical pieces. So a thesis, also known as the position or an argument, that will act as the answer to the question that you were given or the prompt that you were given. Your evidence, which may come in the form of quotes, structural devices used by an author, aesthetic features, those sorts of things. All the sort of strategies that they use to communicate meaning. Then your analysis of those things. You're unpacking things to actually look at what they mean, why it's relevant to what you're arguing. And then sometimes audience positioning is important as well, depending on the piece that you're writing. So how does each of the other elements position the audience to think, feel, or react? So this is a bit of a formula you can use. What is your evidence? So what is your analysis of what it means? So how does it position audiences? And so now is linking back to the thesis. And also just back to that, when I say context, make sure when you're bringing in evidence, don't just plonk it in without any sort of understanding of what's actually happened. So a mistake that a lot of students make is making a quote one whole sentence in itself. So starting the sentence with just the quote and finishing it, and no sort of introduction to it. So this person said this, and then opening the quote is what you should be going for. Otherwise, think about if someone was reading it to themselves, someone was reading it out loud and someone else was listening. If you just have a quote by itself as a sentence, people aren't seeing the quotation marks to know that it's a quote, so they're not going to really have that clarity when they're hearing it. When you introduce it properly, give some context and say, this person is saying this, then it shows greater knowledge and provides greater clarity. Okay, so how to make your essay flow. Refer back to your thesis constantly. Use the same words or synonyms of those words. Link your paragraphs using topic sentences. They should be clear markers of what your paragraph is about and how your argument is being built. And check that your ideas make sense in the order you have them in. So it's all very well saying that you need to link your paragraphs together, but in order to do that well, you've got to have chosen an effective order for your points to begin with. So sometimes that can be chronological. If in a text certain things are happening. So an example may be you're arguing that Lady Macbeth is evil in Shakespeare's Macbeth play. So you can take a chronological approach by having she sort of gets more evil as it goes on because she at first is involved in plotting the regicide, which means the murder of King Duncan, and then she actually sort of is directly involved in it happening. It actually happens. So that chronological idea, your first paragraph could be about the planning stage. Your second paragraph could be about the execution. Your third paragraph could be acknowledging that she actually becomes really, really guilty and remorseful at the end. And so that idea of taking a chronological approach. It's not always chronological. Sometimes there's better ways of doing it, but that's just an example of thinking about how it all makes sense to work together. Annotate your text well, highlight your quotes, mark characters and themes, and do basic analysis as you go. Practice analyzing key quotes in depth. Something that people sometimes fall into is just stating the obvious, like just a quote says something and your analysis of it is basically saying the same thing in your own words. You need to really dig deep when you're analyzing to show a deeper understanding and to be beyond just surface level. Plan your essay before you write it, of course. I can't emphasize that enough. So here is a bit of an example that you can read through in greater detail. And it follows that formula that we have seen. So you can see here what I meant before. In our second sentence, when confronted with the vulnerable Claudius in prayer, Hamlet evades the deed of killing him. And you've got a colon there to introduce the quote. If you don't want to have a colon, you could just have a different structure where you say Hamlet states and then open quotation. So that there's essentially two ways that I recommend introducing quotes, having that colon idea or just having some kind of says or stated or something like that. So I would encourage you to read through that in your own time to really see how it relates to that formula we've got at the bottom there.